The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to a dead woman, and Florence Ralston read it twice before she understood that it was going to save her life. It was the spring of 1878, and Cincinnati was no place for a woman with nothing left to her name. The boarding house on Vine Street smelled of boiled cabbage and old regrets, and Florence had been living there for 11 months since the fever had taken her older sister, Cecilia, and left Florence with $2, a carpet bag, and the particular loneliness that comes from watching your last family member close her eyes and not open them again. Florence was 22 years old, and the world felt like a door that had been shut firmly in her face. Cecilia had been the clever one, the practical one. She had arranged everything before she got sick, the way careful people do when they sense that time is running thin. She had answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette, one of those notices that ran in newspapers from Ohio to Pennsylvania, placed by ranchers and farmers and men of the Western territories who needed wives, and had enough honesty about the situation to say so plainly. The man who had placed the advertisement was named James Atkins of Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory. He had described himself as 31 years old, owner of a cattle ranch, a man of modest but stable means who was seeking a woman of good character for the purposes of marriage and the building of a life together. He had included a postal address and a simple line at the end that Florence would remember for the rest of her days. "I am not looking for perfection. I am looking for someone who is willing to try." Cecilia had written to him. They had exchanged 4 letters. And then Cecilia had gotten sick, and the arrangement had fallen apart in the way that arrangements do when death interrupts them, and Florence had never thought to tell Mr. James Atkins of Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory, that his intended was gone. The letter that arrived that Tuesday was from James himself. It was brief and practical, the way Florence would come to learn that his letters always were, but there was a warmth underneath the careful words that she felt as clearly as she felt the spring air coming through her cracked window. He wrote that the stagecoach route from Santa Fe through the high desert had finally been repaired after the winter washouts, and that the journey west would be possible again from early May. He wrote that he had arranged for a room at the hotel in Harlow Creek, so that there would be time for them to meet properly before anything was decided, and that he wanted her to know she was under no obligation she felt uncomfortable with. He signed it, "Your servant and hopefully your friend, James Atkins." Florence sat in her chair for a long time after reading that letter. She sat while the boarding house made its evening sounds around her, the clatter of pots from Mrs. Hennessy's kitchen, the laughter from the men in the room above hers, the creak of the building settling into itself. She sat and she looked at the letter and she thought about Cecilia, who had been 26 and bright, and who had wanted so badly to go west and start again. She thought about her own $2. She thought about Mrs. Hennessy, who had been patient but who had mentioned twice in the past week that she had a cousin coming who would need the room. The next morning, Florence Ralston took the last of her money, walked to the post office, and wrote back to James Atkins using her sister's name. She told herself it was only until she arrived. She told herself she would explain everything the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. She told herself a great many things that she only half believed, the way people do when they are desperate, and the only door left open is one they know they have no real right to walk through. She signed the letter Cecilia Ralston, folded it carefully, and mailed it before she could change her mind. The journey west took 3 weeks. Florence traveled by train from Cincinnati to Kansas City, and then by stage from Kansas City down through the long, rolling flatlands and into the high desert country of the New Mexico Territory, and every mile of it was a revelation. She had grown up in a city. She had never seen land that went on like this, without a building or a road or any sign of human interruption, just grass and sky, and the occasional red mesa rising from the earth like something that had always been there, and would always be there long after every person now living had gone to their particular reward. It frightened her. It also thrilled her in a way she did not have a name for, a feeling in her chest like the first deep breath after a long time underwater. She shared the stage with a traveling salesman named Perkins, who talked without stopping for the first 2 days and then fell into an exhausted silence that lasted the rest of the journey, and a quiet Navajo woman named Dolly, who was returning to her family near Harlow Creek after visiting a daughter who had married and moved east. Dolly did not speak much, but she had kind eyes, and she gave Florence a piece of dried fruit on the third day when Florence looked pale from the rocking of the coach, and Florence accepted it gratefully and thought that sometimes kindness comes from the most unexpected directions. The country grew more dramatic the further south and west they traveled. The sky changed color in a way that Florence had not thought skies could do, turning pink and orange, and a deep purple gold in the evenings that made her press her face to the stage window like a child. The land itself was alive with things she could not name, plants that looked like nothing she had ever seen, birds that seemed to exist in colors someone had invented purely for the pleasure of it. Even the heat was different from the heavy, damp heat of Ohio summers. It was dry and clean, and it pressed against her skin like something honest. She thought about James Atkins every day. She thought about his letter and its careful warmth. She thought about the lie she was carrying with her, packed away in the carpetbag alongside her 2 good dresses and Cecilia's small silver brooch, which Florence wore because it was the last thing she had of her sister, and because it seemed right, somehow, to bring Cecilia along on the journey she had planned. She rehearsed what she would say when she got off the stage. She rehearsed it 100 different ways, some gentle, some blunt, some that began with an apology and some that began with an explanation, and none of them felt adequate. There was no adequate explanation for writing to a man using a dead woman's name. There was only the truth, and Florence resolved that the truth was what she would give him the moment she arrived, regardless of what it cost her. Harlow Creek was not large. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of red rock, the kind of small western town that had grown up around a water source and a stagecoach stop, and the particular human need to put down roots in whatever patch of ground was nearest when the traveling got hard enough. There was a main street with a general store, a hotel, a livery stable, a saloon, and a small church at the far end. There were houses spreading out from the main street like spokes from a wheel, and beyond the houses the open land stretched away in all directions, and beyond that the mountains sat on the horizon like a promise. The stage rolled in on a Thursday afternoon in late May, and the air smelled of dust and sagebrush and something faintly sweet that Florence would later learn was wild sage blooming after a rain. She was looking out the window as they came into town, watching the buildings appear one by one in the golden afternoon light, and that was how she first saw James Atkins. He was standing at the edge of the street near the stage stop, and she knew it was him before she had any logical reason to know. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that had been recently combed into something approaching order, wearing a clean shirt and a good hat held down against the afternoon wind. He was standing very still in the way that a man stands when he has been waiting a long time and is trying not to let his nerves show in his body. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the stage. Florence could not yet see his face clearly through the dust and the distance, but she felt something happen in her chest that she could not explain, a recognition that did not depend on having met him before. The stage rocked to a stop, and the driver called out Harlow Creek in a voice that carried all the particular weariness of a man who has said the same thing too many times, and Florence sat in her seat for a moment without moving, her hands folded in her lap, her heart doing something complicated and very fast. The salesman Perkins was already climbing out, and Dolly was gathering her things with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and Florence sat in the middle of it all and felt the full weight of what she had done come down on her shoulders like a sudden rain. Then the door opened from the outside, and James Atkins was standing there, and she saw his face for the first time. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that the heroes of the dime novels Florence had read as a girl were handsome. His face was weathered from outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes and across his forehead, and he had a jaw that was strong without being brutal, and dark eyes that looked at her with an expression she had not expected. She had expected a stranger's polite assessment. What she got was something more complicated. His eyes moved over her face with an attention that was careful and quiet and completely unguarded, and she had the strange, disorienting sense that he was reading something in her that she had not intended to write. He reached up and took off his hat. His voice when he spoke was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that words were worth more when they were not rushed. "You must be the lady coming to meet James Atkins," he said. It was not quite a question. Florence noticed that. "I am," she said, and she heard the slight tremor in her own voice and hated it. He offered his hand to help her down, and she took it, and the moment her feet touched the ground of Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, he said something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Whatever name you have come here wearing, you are welcome in this town." Florence went completely still. She looked up at him, and the afternoon light was behind him, and his face was steady and patient, and she understood that he knew. She did not know how he knew, whether he had heard something in her voice or seen something in her face, or whether he had some other quality that she had not yet found a name for. But she understood with absolute clarity that he knew she was not the woman who had written to him, and that he was telling her it did not matter, and that he was saying come down anyway. She felt something give way in her chest, not in a painful way, in the way that a knot gives way when the right amount of patience has been applied to it. "My name is Florence," she said. "Florence Ralston. Cecilia was my sister." James Atkins looked at her for a moment that seemed to contain the length of a whole afternoon. Then he put his hat back on, and the corner of his mouth lifted in an expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough to warm her, and he said, "Well then, Florence Ralston, I have a room reserved for you at the hotel, and Mrs. Garfield has made a supper that is considerably better than anything you will have had on that stage. Would you like to come and get settled?" She said yes. She said it before she had finished deciding to, and she picked up her carpet bag, and she walked with him down the dusty main street of Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, in the golden light of a May afternoon in 1878. And she had the overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful sensation that she had just arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it for her entire life. The hotel was clean and plainly furnished, and the room Mrs. Garfield showed her to had a window that looked east toward the mountains, and a pitcher of water and a basin, and a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing with color. Florence set her carpetbag on the floor and stood at the window for a long time, watching the mountains go purple in the evening, and she thought about Cecilia. She thought about how Cecilia would have handled this better. Cecilia would have arrived with a plan and a clear head, and she would have made the whole situation work with the practical grace she brought to everything. Florence thought about how much she missed her, with the kind of missing that does not get better but does, over time, get quieter. She held the silver brooch that was pinned to her dress, and she said out loud in the empty room, "I will make it right, Cease. I do not know how yet, but I will." Supper was in the hotel dining room, and James was there when she came down, sitting at a table by the window, and he stood when she entered in the way that a man stands when he means it, not as a formality, but as a gesture of genuine regard. Florence had changed into her better dress, a dark blue wool with small white buttons that Cecilia had helped her make the autumn before, and she had pinned up her hair and washed her face, and she felt approximately like herself, which was the best she could manage. They sat across from each other, and Mrs. Garfield brought out a supper of roasted chicken and bread, and a vegetable soup that tasted like something made with actual care, and Florence discovered that she was ravenous in the way that you are ravenous after a long journey when you have finally stopped moving long enough to notice your own hunger. James let her eat before he said anything of substance. She appreciated that more than she said. When she had eaten enough to feel human again, she looked across the table at him and said, "I owe you an explanation." "You do not owe me anything," James said, "but I will listen if you want to give one." So Florence told him. She told him about Cecilia, about the fever, about the 4 letters, about the boarding house on Vine Street and the $2 and Mrs. Hennessy's cousin. She told him about sitting in her chair reading his letter with the spring air coming through the cracked window, and understanding that the only open door was one that belonged to someone else. She told him about signing Cecilia's name, and how it had felt, and how she had told herself 100 times that she would explain everything the moment she arrived, and how she had not quite managed to do it before he did it for her. She told him all of it, and she kept her hands flat on the table and her voice as steady as she could make it, and she looked at him while she spoke because she thought he deserved that much. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of the evening through the open window, the wind in the dry grass, the distant sound of something moving in the street outside. James was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slightly in his hands with the habitual, unconscious motion of a man who thinks better when his hands are occupied. Florence waited. "My mother died when I was 9, he said, finally. "My father 3 years later. I have a younger brother in Colorado I have not seen in 6 years because the distance between us has a way of growing without either of us noticing. I know what it is to have no one and to have a door open and to walk through it even when you are not sure you have the right." He looked up at her. "I am not angry with you, Florence. I am not even particularly surprised. People do what they have to do. That does not make them bad people. It only makes them people." Florence had not realized until that moment that she had been holding her breath since before she got on the stage in Kansas City. She let it out slowly, and she felt something that was close to tears but was not quite, something warmer and more complicated than simple relief. "You said you knew," she said. "Before I got off the stage. How did you know?" James smiled then, the full version of the smile this time, and it changed his whole face in a way that made Florence's chest do something inconvenient. "Cecilia wrote to me 4 times, he said. "In those 4 letters I came to know her a little. Enough to know the shape of how she thought and how she put words together. Your letter wrote the same words but with a different shape inside them. And then when you looked out the window of the stage as it came in, the expression on your face was the expression of someone seeing something for the first time, not someone who has been imagining a place and finally arriving at it. Cecilia would have looked like she was checking it against a picture she already had. You looked like you were making the picture right then." Florence stared at him. "You read all of that from a window." "I have been ranching alone for 4 years, James said, perfectly seriously. "A man learns to pay attention to what is in front of him." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it came out a little undignified, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and James looked pleased in the understated way that she was beginning to understand was his natural mode of looking pleased. "So," she said when she had recovered herself, "where does that leave us?" James set down his coffee cup and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "It leaves us here," he said. "You are in Harlow Creek. The room at the hotel is paid for 2 weeks. I have a ranch 3 miles out of town that needs a great deal of work and absolutely no conversation, which has been its problem for some time. My original intention was to meet a woman who had written to me, and if we suited each other, to ask her properly and do things properly. My original intention required a different woman to step off that stage, but you stepped off instead, and I find that I am not sorry about that." He paused. "I think we should take the 2 weeks, get to know each other like civilized people, and at the end of it decide together what the situation is." Florence looked at him for a long moment. The candle on the table between them was burning low, and the light it made was warm and unsteady, and she thought that she had been afraid for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that did not feel threatening. This felt like something else entirely, something she did not quite have a word for yet. "All right," she said. 2 weeks. The first week passed in the particular way that early time with a person you are beginning to care about passes, at once too fast and full of details, that you find yourself cataloging with an attention you cannot entirely explain. James came to the hotel every morning at 8 and took her out to see the country around Harlow Creek, because he said she ought to know the land if she was considering staying in it, and Florence had no argument to make against that logic. He showed her the creek itself, which ran cold and clear out of the rocks to the north, and which was, he explained, the reason the town existed at all. He showed her the canyon country to the east, where the red rock walls rose up 200 feet on either side of a narrow passage, and the shadows inside them were the deep blue of early evening at any time of day. He showed her the wide flat grassland south of the ranch where the cattle grazed, and he showed her the cattle themselves, longhorns with their wide heads and their general attitude of weary dignity. And Florence stood at the fence and looked at them and thought that they were genuinely impressive animals, large and strange and utterly indifferent to her presence. She learned things about him in the incidental way that you learn things about a person when you are spending time in their presence, without the pressure of needing to perform anything. She learned that he had come to the New Mexico Territory in 1872, 6 years ago from Tennessee, and that he had homesteaded the ranch land and built the house with his own hands and the help of 2 men from town, one of them a Mexican man named Esteban Vargas, who was still his only regular hired hand, and who, when Florence met him, turned out to be a compact, serious man of about 40 with a dry humor and an extremely good hat. She learned that James had read more books than she expected, that he kept a shelf of them in the ranch house, battered and well used, and that he reread favorites in the evenings when the work was done. She learned that he was patient with animals in a way that suggested it was not a technique but an instinct, that the horses came to him without being called, and that even Esteban's difficult old mule, who famously disliked everyone, would accept an apple from James's hand without incident. She told him things too, because he asked, and because his questions were specific and genuine rather than polite. She told him about growing up in Cincinnati with Cecilia, about their mother who had been a school teacher and who had died when Florence was 14, their father who had worked at the riverfront and who had been a kind man but not a strong one, and who had followed their mother at 60 of a heart that gave out too young. She told him about working at a milliner's shop for 3 years before the shop closed, and then at a laundry, and that none of it had been terrible but none of it had been what she wanted either, and that she had not, until she had read his letter in her boarding-house room, known clearly what she wanted, only that it was not what she had. On the 4th day, they rode out to the far edge of his land together, James on his bay horse and Florence on a quiet roan mare that James said was the most sensible horse on the property, and that Florence privately agreed was the most sensible creature she had met in some time. They rode to the top of a low ridge and stopped, and below them the land opened up into a vast, copper-and-gold expanse that stretched to mountains on 3 sides and to the sky on the 4th, and Florence sat on the roan mare and felt the wind move through her hair, which had come half loose from its pins during the ride, and she felt something happen in her that was final and permanent, the way that certain feelings are final and permanent once they arrive. "This is yours," she said. "This is what I came for," James said. He was sitting easy on his horse in the way of a man who has spent a great many hours on horseback, looking out at the land with an expression she recognized now as his particular version of happiness, quiet and complete. "I grew up in a valley in Tennessee that was beautiful, but that felt like it already belonged to everyone who had come before me. I wanted something that I had made mine by being in it, by working it, not taking it from anyone, just being here long enough that it knew me." Florence thought about the Navajo woman Dolly on the stagecoach, and about the land that had been here long before any of them, and she said, "Someone was here before." James looked at her. There was no defensiveness in his expression, only a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "Yes," he said. "There is a Navajo family that lives along the canyon country to the east. We have an understanding. They move through when the seasons call for it, and I do not interfere. It is not a perfect arrangement, and I know it is not the same as what was taken, but I try to be a decent neighbor at least." He paused. "The world has a great many injustices built into it that I did not create but that I live inside of. I try not to add to them." Florence nodded. She thought that was an honest answer, not a triumphant one but an honest one, and she had come to understand in 4 days that James Atkins was above almost all else an honest man, and that this quality in him, which she had not thought to look for because she had not known to, was the quality she found most striking. They sat on the ridge for a long time, not talking, just being present in the enormous afternoon, and Florence was aware of him beside her with a physicality she was not used to, the warmth of another person at a comfortable distance, the steadiness of his presence, and she thought, "You have to be careful, Florence," and then she thought, "But maybe careful is not the only thing to be." The second week brought a development that Florence had not anticipated, which was the town itself beginning to pay attention. Harlow Creek was small enough that a newcomer was noticed and discussed, and Florence was, she came to understand, a particular object of interest, being a young woman from the East who had arrived on the stage and was spending considerable time with the town's most eligible bachelor. The interest was not unkind, for the most part. Mrs. Garfield, who ran the hotel and who seemed to be the center of the town's social life in the way that certain women in certain small towns always are, was warm and forthcoming, and brought Florence extra biscuits at breakfast with the specific energy of a woman who has been hoping something interesting would happen, and is pleased that it has. A woman named Martha Pryor, who ran the general store with her husband, introduced herself on Florence's 3rd day, and invited her to a women's sewing circle that met on Wednesday afternoons, which Florence attended, and which turned out to be less about sewing than about the exchange of information and opinion, conducted with considerable efficiency and good humor. At the sewing circle, Florence met several women who would become important to her in the months ahead, among them Clara Webb, who was 24 and had come west herself 3 years earlier to marry a blacksmith, and who had the particular sharp wit of someone who has reinvented herself at least twice and knows it. Clara took to Florence with an immediacy that Florence found both touching and slightly overwhelming, the way that certain friendships begin in a rush and then settle into something durable. "So you are the mystery woman," Clara said, threading her needle with the efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, not looking up. "Half the town thinks you are James Atkins's mail-order bride, and the other half thinks something considerably more interesting is going on." Florence decided immediately that she liked Clara. "Something considerably more interesting is going on," she said, and Clara looked up and grinned, and that was the beginning of a friendship that Florence would treasure for decades. The complication arrived on Thursday of the 2nd week, in the form of a man named Douglas Hale. Douglas Hale was 35 and owned the largest saloon in Harlow Creek, and had a way of occupying space that made Florence immediately alert, the way you are alert around something that has a pleasant surface and an uncertain interior. He was handsome in a practiced way, and he had been in the habit, Florence gathered from the careful way several people mentioned his name, of being a significant social force in the town. He approached Florence outside the general store on Thursday morning with a broad smile and a hat that he removed with a flourish, and he said he had heard she was considering settling in Harlow Creek and that he hoped she would find it welcoming. Florence said thank you, and that she was finding it very welcoming. Hale said that he hoped she had not been monopolized entirely by James Atkins, who was a fine enough man, but could be somewhat dull in the company of a woman as clearly interesting as herself. Florence said pleasantly that she had not found him dull in the least. Hale looked at her with an expression that recalibrated itself behind the smile in a way she noticed. He said he hoped she would visit the saloon sometime, as he had recently had a piano brought in from Santa Fe, and it made for a very fine evening, and Florence said she would bear that in mind, and she retrieved her parcel from the store counter and walked back to the hotel with the distinct feeling of having been assessed. She mentioned Douglas Hale to James that afternoon, not because she was alarmed, but because she thought he should know. James's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it became more careful, the way a man looks when he is choosing what to say from a range of things he could say. Douglas Hale is not a bad man, James said after a moment, but he has a way of deciding that things belong to him before asking whether they agree. We have had our differences on certain business matters in the past. Florence raised an eyebrow. What sort of differences? The sort that involve water rights and the fact that he owns the piece of land between my north fence line and the creek, and that he has been making that fact uncomfortable for the past 2 years. Has he been restricting your access to the water? He has been making suggestions about what it might be worth for me to have continued access. Nothing that has come to a real confrontation yet, but it has been building. He looked at her with his steady, honest gaze. I am telling you this so you understand the whole picture. I have no wish to make you feel like a piece in some larger game. You are here for your own reasons and your own life, whatever you decide about this situation. But I thought you should know that Hale has interests in this town that are not always what they present themselves as. Florence appreciated this considerably. She appreciated the straightforwardness of it, the lack of drama, the trust it represented. Thank you for telling me, she said. I am not going to tell you who to talk to, James said. I am not that kind of man. No, Florence said, looking at him. I can see that you are not. The end of the 2 weeks arrived with the particular swiftness that endings have when you have been both anticipating and dreading them. It was a Saturday evening, and James had come to the hotel and taken Florence to supper at Mrs. Garfield's table, and they had eaten the best meal Florence had had in Harlow Creek, a roasted leg of lamb with potatoes and fresh bread, and a dried fruit pie that was extraordinary. And they had talked and laughed and been easy with each other in the way that had grown gradually natural over the past 14 days. After supper they sat on the hotel's small porch while the evening came down, and the sky went through its western performance of color, rose and gold, and the deep, aching blue that came just before the stars appeared. Florence had her shawl around her shoulders and she was looking at the mountains, and James was beside her, and it was quiet except for the sounds of the town settling into its evening. I think I would like to stay, Florence said. She said it to the mountains rather than to him, which made it easier. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have thought about that, and I want to be clear that the reasons are not only practical. I think I would like to stay because this place has done something to me that I did not expect, and because I have found that your company is something I would be sorry to be without. She paused. I understand that the original arrangement was with Cecilia and that I am a different person entirely. You are a different person, James agreed, his voice quiet and warm. I would not want to pretend otherwise. Cecilia sounds like she was a remarkable woman, and I am sorry she did not get to come here herself. But you are also remarkable, Florence, and you are the one who is here, and I would be a fool to sit on this porch and pretend that the last 2 weeks have not been the best 2 weeks I have had in longer than I can easily account for. Florence turned to look at him. The first stars were coming out, and the evening was warm and smelled of sage, and she thought she had never in her life felt quite so present in a moment, so completely inside a single point in time. Are you asking me something? She said. James reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a ring, a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, and held it in his palm in the direct, unceremonious way that matched everything else about him. I am asking you to marry me, he said. Not because of a letter and not because of an arrangement. Because you are Florence Ralston and I have spent 2 weeks finding out who that is, and I find that I want to keep finding out. He paused. I know it is fast. I know I am not a man who is easy to know, and the ranch is hard work and this is not an easy country. I want you to go into it with your eyes open, and I want you to say yes only if you mean it." Florence looked at the ring in his hand, the turquoise catching the last light, the silver simple and clean. She thought about the boarding house on Vine Street and the $2 and the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning addressed to a dead woman. She thought about the stage rolling into Harlow Creek and the feeling of recognition that had moved through her when she first saw him standing at the edge of the street, steady and patient, waiting. She thought about riding on the ridge above the canyon and the feeling that had arrived in her, final and permanent. "I mean it," she said. He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which surprised her, and she said so, and he said quietly that he had asked Mrs. Garfield, who had been watching the situation with professional attention, to estimate the size, and Florence laughed, and he smiled. And then without any further discussion they were kissing in the dusk on the hotel porch, with the stars coming out above them and the mountains on the horizon. And it was not the kiss of two people who are performing something for an audience, but the kiss of two people who have been moving toward each other with the steady, inevitable pace of rivers meeting, and have finally arrived. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday in June when the air smelled of wildflowers, and the light was the particular honey gold of early summer. Clara Webb stood with Florence, and Esteban Vargas stood with James, and Mrs. Garfield cried in the front pew with the thoroughness of someone who considers other people's weddings a personal gift to herself. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldrich, who had come west from Illinois, and who performed the ceremony with a combination of solemnity and evident pleasure that Florence found entirely appropriate. Florence wore her dark blue dress with the white buttons, and she wore Cecilia's silver brooch at her collar, and she stood in front of James Atkins in the small Western church, and said "I do" with a clarity and conviction that she felt in her bones, the kind of certainty that does not require examination because it is simply there, like the mountains or the sky or the cold, clear water of the creek. Afterward, there was a celebration at Mrs. Garfield's hotel that involved the majority of the town and considerable quantities of food and music and dancing. Fiddle music played by a man from the Mexican community south of town named Louis, who played with his eyes closed and a small smile on his face, and who could make a fiddle sound like it was telling you something important. Florence danced with James and then with Esteban, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer, and then with Clara's husband, who was not, and then with James again, and then she stood at the edge of the dancing and watched the town around her and felt, with a depth that surprised her, that she was home. Douglas Hale was not at the wedding. Florence had not expected him to be. They moved into the ranch house the following Monday, and Florence began to understand what she had agreed to in the most practical possible sense. The house was solid and plainly made, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, with a covered porch that faced west and caught the afternoon shade. James had built it himself, and it showed, not in any deficiency but in the particular quality of something made by someone who cared more about it being right than about it being fast. The floors were good pine boards, worn smooth, and the windows were real glass, which was not nothing in 1878 New Mexico territory. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and a wood stove in the kitchen that James told her had been a significant investment, and that she was welcome to treat accordingly. Florence had grown up in cities, and she had worked at laundries and hat shops, and she did not know how to run a ranch household, and she told James this plainly. He said that was fine, that there was nothing about it that could not be learned, and that the same had been true of him and ranching when he had arrived in this territory 6 years ago, without knowing what he was doing, and had learned by making mistakes with a determination that eventually produced results. He was an unhurried and unembarrassed teacher, the best kind, the kind who shows you the thing and then lets you do it and does not hover over your shoulder while you figure it out. She learned to bake bread in the wood stove, which took her 3 attempts before she produced something that resembled a loaf rather than a very dense stone. She learned to tend the kitchen garden that James had started and somewhat neglected, and she discovered that she had a genuine aptitude for growing things, that there was something in her that responded to the work of putting seeds in the ground and watching what they became, something patient and hopeful that she had not known was there. She learned to ride properly, not just the careful trail riding she had done in the 2 weeks at the hotel, but real working riding, riding with a purpose. And James taught her with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, walking alongside her at first, and then stepping back as she found her balance and her confidence. Esteban, who came to the ranch 5 days a week to help with the cattle work, began to teach her Spanish in the way that people who share a language will sometimes teach it to someone they have decided is worth the effort, casually at first, offering words for things as they encountered them, and then in longer exchanges as Florence made it clear that she was interested and would remember what she was told. His wife, a woman named Rosa who occasionally came to help with larger tasks like canning and the making of soap, spoke better English than she initially let on and became, in time, a quiet and valued presence in Florence's life. The trouble with Douglas Hale came to a head in August. It had been building in the way James had described, through incremental pressures and suggestions, and the occasional pointed mention of the land he owned between the ranch's north fence and the creek. But in August, Hale brought in men and began constructing a fence along his property line that effectively blocked the path James had been using to move cattle to the creek for watering, the path he had been using for 6 years without formal arrangement, but with the tacit understanding that had served in lieu of one. James came in from the North Range on a Tuesday afternoon with his jaw set in a way Florence had learned to read, and he told her what had happened, and she listened carefully and then said, "What do we do?" he said. "Legally, he has the right. The land is his. I have been foolish to rely on a gentleman's understanding for 6 years when I should have had it in writing." Florence thought about this. "There is another water source," she said, "the creek that comes through the canyon to the east. It dries to a trickle in September. It would not sustain the herd." Florence was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is Hale actually asking for?" James looked at her. "He has not made a formal offer yet, but the word from town is that he wants the east pasture, the 50 acres along the canyon wall." Florence thought about the canyon, the red walls and the deep blue shadows and the Navajo family that moved through it with the seasons. She thought about what that land meant, practically and otherwise. She said, "And if you give it to him, then he opens the path and I have water for the herd. And if you do not, then I dig a new well on the South Range and move the herd, which costs money and time and may not be feasible before the September dry." Florence did not say anything for a while. She was thinking with the careful, practical thoroughness she had learned from years of managing a precarious life on inadequate means, and James, who had by this point developed a sound instinct for when Florence was working through something and should not be interrupted, waited. "Go to the county land office," she said, finally. "Check the original deed for your property. Check what water rights were recorded when you homesteaded. They may not have been recorded at all, which is a different problem, but they may have been, in which case you have a legal position regardless of Hale's fence." James looked at her with an expression she had only seen a few times and which she had come to understand as his particular version of being impressed. "I had not thought of that," he said. "You have been thinking about the practical problem," Florence said. "I was thinking about the legal one." The deed, as it turned out, included a water rights statement that had been recorded in the county register in 1872, along with the original homestead claim, granting James access to the creek via the most direct route across any intervening land, a provision that had been standard in the territorial homestead agreements of that period to prevent exactly the kind of situation that was now arising. Florence found this out because she rode into town herself the morning after their conversation, while James was dealing with the cattle, and she spent 4 hours in the county land office with the clerk, a meticulous young man named Thomas Wiley, who clearly enjoyed the opportunity to dig through his records until they found the original document. She came home with a copy of the deed and the relevant provision underlined, and she gave it to James, and he read it, and then he looked at her with an expression that went beyond the impressed version of his look into something deeper and more personal. "Florence," he said. "You can have your lawyer in Santa Fe write to Hale," she said. "He will know the fence has no legal standing and he will remove it. How do you know about water rights provisions in homestead deeds?" "I do not, specifically, but I know how to find things out. I worked in a milliner's shop for 3 years. The owner was forever in disputes about the lease, and I helped her with the paperwork because she was better at hats than at documents. You learn to look for the paper that proves what you need it to prove." James set down the deed copy and crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in a manner that was both extremely thorough and deeply sincere, and Florence, who was still holding her riding gloves, let them fall to the floor and kissed him back, and for a while the water rights document lay unattended on the kitchen table. The letter from James's lawyer in Santa Fe arrived at Douglas Hale's office the following week. The fence came down within the month. Hale was not gracious about it, but he was defeated, and in the particular culture of small western towns, the story traveled in the way that such stories travel, with the result that the general community opinion of Florence Ralston Atkins went up several notches from where it had already been sitting. Clara Webb, when Florence told her the story at the Wednesday sewing circle, looked at her for a moment and then said, with considerable admiration, "You are absolutely terrifying, you know that." Florence said she was not sure that was a compliment. Clara said it was absolutely a compliment, the best one she gave. The autumn that year was extraordinary. Florence had not known what autumn was supposed to look like in the New Mexico territory, and it turned out to be something entirely different from Ohio autumns, less about color and more about a quality of the light, a clarity and golden precision that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time at its best before the winter came. The days shortened, and the air had a cutting edge to it in the mornings and the evenings, and the mountains changed their colors in their own way, the pine dark green at the higher elevations and the tawny gold of the lower slopes, and Florence stood on the ranch house porch in the early mornings with her coffee and watched them, and felt the particular happiness of a person who has found their right place and knows it. She and James worked the ranch together through the autumn preparations, the laying in of feed for the winter, the checking and mending of fences, the last cattle drive south to the seasonal grazing lands. Esteban and his wife, Rosa, helped with the larger tasks, and there were other people from the surrounding ranches and the town who came and went in the pattern of mutual assistance that Florence was learning was how things were done in these communities, the way that isolation made people either suspicious of their neighbors or invested in them, and in Harlow Creek it had mostly produced the invested version. One afternoon in October, Florence was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the late vegetables when she heard hoofbeats on the track from the road, and she stood up to see who was coming. It was Dolly, the Navajo woman from the stagecoach, riding a small gray horse with the easy confidence of someone who has been on horseback since childhood. She stopped at the garden fence and looked at Florence with her quiet, perceptive eyes. "I heard you married James Atkins," Dolly said. "I thought I would come and see if you had settled in well." Florence said she had, and invited Dolly in for coffee, and Dolly came and sat at the kitchen table, and they talked for an hour. And Florence found that the conversation picked up something from the stage journey with a naturalness that was pleasant. Dolly was direct and clear in the way of a person who has learned that courtesy is not the same as imprecision, and she asked questions that had real answers expected to them rather than just polite sounds, and Florence appreciated this. Dolly said that she had come through the canyon country to the east on her way here, and that the family she had mentioned on the stage, the family that lived in the canyon, was doing reasonably well, though the past summer had been harder than usual. Florence asked if there was anything that was needed, thinking of the kitchen garden and what she had laid in, and Dolly looked at her for a moment with an expression that was assessing but not unkind. "There is always something needed," Dolly said. "The question is whether the help is given in a way that is respectful." Florence thought about that. "Tell me how to do it respectfully, and I will do it that way," she said. Dolly nodded, as if this was the answer she had been waiting to hear. "Then I will tell James's neighbor to the east that there is a woman at the Atkins ranch who means well and knows how to take direction." That was the beginning of a relationship between the ranch and the canyon community that developed slowly and carefully over the following years, built on the mutual understanding that Dolly had suggested, and that Florence did her best to honor, trading fairly, giving what was asked for without making it charity, receiving the knowledge and courtesy that was offered in return without making it a curiosity. It was not a perfect relationship, and Florence would not have claimed it was. But it was an honest one, and she believed that honest was the only starting place worth having. Christmas came, the first one, and James was very matter-of-fact about it in the way that a man alone for years becomes matter-of-fact about celebrations that have lost their shape without someone else to give them form. Florence had strong opinions about Christmas, having grown up in a household where it had been kept with great enthusiasm, and she brought her opinions to the ranch house with the cheerful determination that James had by now identified as one of her defining qualities. There was a tree, a juniper from the hillside above the North Range, decorated with things Florence made from what she had, ribbon and dried oranges and small figures cut from tin by Esteban, who turned out to have a genuine skill with metalwork. Mrs. Garfield contributed a cake. Clara and her husband Thomas came for dinner on Christmas Day itself, and Esteban and Rosa came with their 2 young children. And the ranch house was full in a way it had not been in a long time, full of noise and laughter and the smell of food and fire. And James sat at the head of his table with the quiet, full expression of a man who has been given something he was afraid to want. After the guests had gone and the children were asleep and Clara and Thomas had headed back to town in their wagon, Florence and James sat by the fire, and she leaned against him with her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and outside the wind was coming down off the mountains with the sound of all that open country in it. "I would like to tell you something," Florence said. "All right," James said, in his way of saying it that meant go ahead, I am listening. "I have been thinking about Cecilia a great deal lately," she said, "about whether what I did was right. Not in terms of you, I have made my peace with that, but in terms of her, whether I took something from her." James was quiet for a moment, which meant he was actually thinking about it rather than just reassuring her. "What do you think?" he finally said. Florence looked at the fire. "I think she wanted to come west and start again. I think she would have liked it here. I think she might even have liked you." She paused. "But I also think that what happened the way it was supposed to happen, in the peculiar way that some things do. She wrote to you, and her letters made you the kind of person who would look at a woman getting off a stage and read her correctly. She got you ready for me without knowing she was doing it." James turned his head to look at her, and in the firelight his face had an openness that she had come to love deeply, the way that his careful, guarded exterior gave way in the right conditions to something much softer and more revealing. "That is a generous way to think about it," he said. "It is the true way," Florence said. She held up the hand with the turquoise ring. "I still wear her brooch. I think she would have wanted me to be happy. She was that kind of person." "Then I am glad she was," James said, and pulled her a little closer, and the fire crackled and the wind talked outside, and Florence felt something that was both contentment and longing and love and grief all at once, the complex true feeling that you feel when you are genuinely alive in a moment and not performing your feelings about it. The spring of 1879 brought everything at once, the way springs do in the high desert, sudden and enormous after the long restraint of winter. The garden came back to life faster than Florence had expected, and she expanded it, adding a new bed along the south side of the house where the light was best. And she planted tomatoes and beans, and corn in the old Pueblo style that Dolly had shown her, which took into account the particular dryness of the soil and the need to preserve moisture. The cattle had come through the winter in good condition, which James said was better than average, and in the spring work there was a rhythm to the days that Florence had grown to love, the early mornings and the long outdoor hours and the productive tiredness of evenings. In April, Florence told James that they were expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table because that was where most of their important conversations happened, and she told him directly in the way she had always told him things. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something moved him beyond the reach of immediate language, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them. "Are you well?" he asked first. She said she was, that she had felt the usual morning unpleasantness but was otherwise entirely fine. He said, after a moment, his voice gone low and careful, "I did not think I would have this." Florence squeezed his hands. "You have it," she said. He smiled then, the full, unguarded version of his smile, the one she kept discovering new things in. "Then I suppose we have it," he said. The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and summer with the particular combination of inconvenience and wonder that pregnancies are. Florence kept working, because stopping would have felt wrong to her, and because the ranch was not the kind of place that permitted extended idleness, though James was quietly and consistently attentive in a way that managed to be helpful without being overbearing, a distinction she was deeply grateful for. Rosa came more often, and Clara came weekly, and Florence found herself surrounded by a community of women who had been doing this in hard country for years, and who passed on their knowledge with the matter-of-fact generosity of people who understand that information shared is a form of survival. Douglas Hale left Harlow Creek in the late summer of 1879, which surprised no one more than Florence. He sold the saloon to a man from Texas and took himself off, and the general opinion was that the town would be fine without him, and the general opinion turned out to be correct. The new owner of the saloon was a quiet man named Franklin who put in a better kitchen and served food as well as drink, and gave the place a character that the town had been lacking. And Florence, who had never once set foot inside a saloon, found herself at Franklin's for supper one evening in October with James and Clara and Thomas, and the evening was so enjoyable that it became a monthly occasion. A son was born on the 15th of November, 1879, which was a cold, clear night with stars in extraordinary numbers visible through the bedroom window. He arrived with considerable insistence, and a healthy voice that carried, according to Esteban, who was in the yard to the far side of the barn. Rosa helped with the delivery, and Clara was there, and James was there, and Florence, who had been afraid of many things in her life, but never, interestingly, of anything she could see clearly in front of her, gripped the headboard of the bed she shared with her husband, and worked at the task with a focused determination that Clara would later describe as entirely typical. When it was done and the baby was in her arms, she looked at the small, red, furious face and felt an emotion that was not like other emotions, not like love as she had previously understood it, or like joy, or like relief, but like something that contained all of those and was also entirely itself. James came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and she watched his face do the thing it did when it was moved past the reach of language, and she thought, "This is a good life. This is a very good life, and I almost did not come here." They named the boy William Cecilio Atkins, William for James's father, whose name had been William. Cecilio, the Spanish form of Cecilia, for a woman who had wanted to come west and start again, and who had, in her own way, made it possible. Esteban, upon hearing the middle name, went very quiet for a moment, and then said something in Spanish that Rosa translated as meaning it is a good name. It carries something forward that deserves to be carried, and Florence thought that was exactly right. The years that followed built on each other in the way that good years do, each one containing more than the last because the foundation was solid. The ranch grew, carefully and in proportion to what could be sustained, a few more acres under cultivation, a few more head of cattle, a hired man to help Esteban in the busier seasons. The house grew too, James and Esteban adding 2 rooms to the back, so that there was space for William and space for whatever came after William, and a proper kitchen with room to work in and a table large enough for guests. Florence's garden became something rather remarkable by the standards of the territory, a productive and organized piece of land that grew a wider variety of things than any garden in the immediate area, and people began to come to her for advice about their own planting, and she gave advice freely and clearly, and was pleased to find that she was good at it. She also found in 1881 that she had a talent for teaching, discovered when she volunteered to help at the small schoolhouse that Harlow Creek had established, sitting in twice a week with the schoolteacher, a young woman just arrived from Missouri, who was excellent at the older students but somewhat at sea with the youngest ones. Florence took the youngest ones and found that she loved it, the concentrated attention of small minds encountering things for the first time, the particular satisfaction of watching a child suddenly understand something that a moment before had been opaque. William grew into a solid, bright boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure, and who from the age of 2 was to be found following both parents around with the intense observation of a child who is taking thorough notes. He learned to ride before he was 4, sitting in front of James on the bay horse with his small hands gripping the saddle horn with all his strength, his face split by a grin so wide it seemed like it might outgrow his face. He was kind, which Florence thought was the most important thing, with the horses and the dogs and with the younger children he encountered, and she thought that this was James's quality in him, that steady, unhurried regard for the things in front of him. A daughter arrived in the spring of 1882, on a morning when the canyon walls were orange with the new sun, and the air smelled of rain that had fallen in the night. She was born easier than William had been, quicker and more direct, and she arrived in the world with her eyes already open in a way that Rosa said she had never seen in 30 years of attending births. They named her Cecilia Margaret Atkins, the first name after the woman who had started everything, the second after James's mother, and called her Ceci, and she was from the first breath the most determined person Florence had ever met, including herself. Florence wrote to no one from Cincinnati, because there was no one left to write to. But she kept a journal, a thing she had begun in the first month at the hotel and had maintained through everything that followed, and in the journal she wrote to Cecilia. She told her about the land and the mountains and the light that was different from any light she had ever seen. She told her about James, who was better than any person she had a right to expect, and who she loved with a completeness that still surprised her sometimes in the morning when she woke beside him and lay for a moment looking at the ceiling, listening to him breathe. She told her about William and Ceci, who were real and miraculous in the way that all children are real and miraculous, which does not make it less astonishing. She told her about the garden and the canyon and Dolly and Esteban and Rosa and Clara and Thomas and Mrs. Garfield, and the whole community of people who had become her world in a way that the boarding house on Vine Street had never managed to be. She told her that the turquoise ring was still on her finger, and that the silver brooch was still pinned in her jewelry box, and that she wore it on special occasions, and that she had never stopped thinking of Cecilia as a presence in the life she was living, not a ghost, but something more like a North Star, the fixed point from which the navigation had begun. The summer of 1883 was a hard one, a drought year, the kind that the old-timers in the territory recognized and prepared for, and the newer arrivals sometimes did not. James had seen enough of the land by then to know the signs, and he and Florence talked carefully through the summer about what the ranch could sustain if the creek ran low and the grass burned off, and they made decisions together in the kitchen at the table, as they made all their decisions, looking at what was real rather than what they wished was real. They sold a portion of the herd in June, before the prices dropped, which James said was the hardest thing to do because it felt like failure and was in fact good management. Florence agreed that it felt like failure and said that feeling and fact were different things and that the ranch needed them to act on fact. They kept the best animals and reduced the east herd and moved everything closer to the creek, and they bought hay from a farmer north of Santa Fe and had it freighted in, which was expensive but kept the core herd fed through the worst of it. In September, when the worst had passed and the autumn rains came and the creek rose again, James and Florence sat on the west porch in the evening and watched the mountains come alive with the relief of water after drought. And the desert turned briefly, impossibly green, and Florence thought that there was a kind of love that was not romantic in the ordinary sense but was something equivalent, the love that was built from working through hard things together without falling apart, from knowing each other's limits and strengths well enough to compensate for one and lean on the other. She said this or something like it, and James looked at her sidelong with the expression she loved, the quiet, considering look that preceded something true. "I have been thinking about love lately," he said. She waited. "I have been thinking that I did not know what it was before. Not really. I thought it was a feeling you had about a person, something you either had or did not have. But I think it is more like the land. It is something you tend and work and build with, and it grows because you do those things, not in spite of the work but because of it." Florence looked at him. The evening light was in his hair and on his face, and the mountains were going gold behind him, and she thought that she had come west wearing her dead sister's name and been found out before she stepped off the stage, and that the man who had found her out had said come down anyway, and that all of it, every part of it, had led to this porch and this evening and this person sitting beside her, and she could not imagine any other life that would have been more hers. "That is the truest thing I have ever heard about love," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the one with the turquoise ring, and held it, and they sat there together in the fading warmth of a September evening in the New Mexico territory, and the mountains kept their ancient, indifferent watch, and the creek ran cold and clear through the canyon, and the ranch house behind them smelled of supper and wood smoke and children, and Florence Ralston Atkins, who had been sent west wearing her sister's name and had been found and welcomed and loved anyway, felt something settle in her that had been moving for a very long time. She felt it settle, and she felt it stay. William was 4 years old when he first climbed up on the fence of the horse paddock and announced to his father that he intended to ride the big gray horse that James had purchased at a spring auction. The gray horse was named Silver, and was 17 hands of opinionated, magnificent animal who had opinions about who rode him, and expressed them clearly. James had been working with the horse for weeks, and the horse had come around to accepting James grudgingly, in the way that horses with strong personalities accept riders they have decided are worth accepting. He looked at his son on the fence and said, "Not yet." William said, "When?" James said, "When you can look him in the eye without looking away first." Florence, who had been watching from the garden, went back to her tomatoes with the particular warm amusement of a woman who knows what she is watching is going to become something good. William practiced looking Silver in the eye for 3 months. He would go to the paddock fence in the evenings and stand there and look at the gray horse with the calm, steady gaze of a 4-year-old, who has been told that this is the thing that needs to happen, and who is therefore applying everything he has to it. Silver watched him back. Gradually, the horse moved closer to the fence. By October, William was feeding him apple slices from his palm, and Silver's great gray head was lowering to accept them with the dignity of a creature granting a significant favor. By November, James lifted William into the saddle and Silver stood perfectly still, and the boy's face was something Florence would remember as long as she lived, the absolute, luminous satisfaction of a person who has earned the thing they wanted. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold but manageable, and they were better prepared than the summer had made them fear. The 2 rooms James and Esteban had added to the house proved their worth in the cold months, and the children had their own space for the first time, which improved the quality of everyone's sleep considerably. Ceci, who was almost 2, had graduated from her cradle to a small bed of her own, and greeted this development with the enthusiasm she brought to everything, climbing in and out of it approximately 40 times on the first night until Florence, with the weary but amused authority of a woman in her 4th year of motherhood, placed her firmly in the bed and sat beside it until the child finally, magnificently, fell asleep. James taught Florence to play chess that winter, in the evenings after the children were in bed, setting up the board on the kitchen table by lamplight. She was a poor student for the first 2 weeks and a dangerous one by the end of the month, and by February she was winning approximately half their games, which James claimed to find satisfying in a way that Florence chose to believe was genuine rather than diplomatic. They played chess and talked, the particular kind of talking that happens between 2 people who have been together long enough to have run out of the formal topics and are now in the richer, less organized territory of actual minds meeting. They talked about books, the ones on James's shelf and the ones Florence sent for from Santa Fe, the novels and the histories and the agricultural journals that were actually both of their favorite reading. They talked about the ranch and the children and the town and the territory and the wider world beyond it, about which they had opinions that did not always agree, and these disagreements were conducted with the genuine mutual respect of 2 people who find each other's positions interesting even when they do not share them. In the spring of 1884, Dolly's youngest daughter came to the ranch looking for help. She was 15, a quiet girl named Yolanda, and she had a younger brother who was very ill and whose condition Dolly was afraid she could not manage alone. Florence went with her the same afternoon, taking everything in her medicine box and what she knew from having helped Rosa with the birth of her youngest child the year before, and she sat with the boy through a long, difficult night, while the wind came off the mountains and James waited at the ranch with the children. The boy, whose name was Kai, was 7 years old and had a fever that had gone on for 3 days, and Florence brought it down with cold water and patience, and the specific, focused attention she had come to understand was the most useful thing any person could offer in a crisis. By morning, the fever broke, and Kai slept the real sleep of someone healing, and Florence rode back to the ranch in the early light exhausted and completely at peace in the way that comes from having done something that mattered. James was waiting on the porch with coffee when she came in. He handed it to her without words. He looked at her face and he understood what it contained, and he said quietly, "The boy." "He will be fine," Florence said. James nodded. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch in the early light with the coffee warming their hands and the mountains turning gold in the new sun. And Florence thought that this was what Cecilia had wanted. Not this specifically, not this man and this land and these mountains, but something with this quality, something that contained real work and real help and real love and the solid company of a person who meant it. "I want to do more of this," Florence said. James looked at her. "Helping when people are sick. Helping. I want to do more of it. There is no doctor within 40 miles of here, and people need help that they do not always know how to ask for." James was quiet for a moment. "I know someone in Santa Fe," he said. "A doctor who has been trying to find someone to train as a practical nurse for the outlying communities. He mentioned it to me last spring at the market. I did not know then that I was going to want to tell you about it." Florence looked at him. "Were you going to tell me at some point?" "I was waiting for you to arrive at it yourself," James said, with a complete straight face. "You get to the important things more efficiently that way." Florence looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You are an extremely provoking man, James Atkins." He smiled, the full version, and she kissed him, her coffee cup still in her hand, and he steadied her with his arm around her waist, and the morning went on doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful work around them. Dr. Samuel Pryor, who was Martha Pryor's husband's distant cousin and who had been practicing in Santa Fe for 12 years, came to Harlow Creek in the summer of 1884 and spent 3 days working with Florence, examining what she already knew, which was considerable in a practical sense, and explaining what she needed to add to it, and leaving her with a supply of medicines and a thick pamphlet of instructions he had written himself over his years of practicing in a place where trained help was scarce. He came back twice that year and twice the following year, and Florence added to what she knew each time, and by 1886 she was the closest thing Harlow Creek had to medical expertise, and the community used her as such with a grateful and matter-of-fact practicality that she found enormously satisfying. She delivered 9 babies in those years, assisted at more than she could count, treated fevers and injuries, and a case of appendicitis that she got to Santa Fe in time by riding through the night. And in all of it, she maintained the same focused, unhurried quality she had brought to everything, the quality of a person who understands that the moment in front of her is the one that matters. She also wrote to Cecilia in the journal still all those years. She wrote to her about all of it, the garden and the children and the ranch and the medicine and the chess games and the winter evenings by the fire. She wrote to her about James with the particular freedom of writing to someone who cannot be embarrassed, who cannot interrupt, who is pure recipient. She wrote, on one October evening in 1886, "I think you sent me here, Cease. Not with a plan, you were not that knowing, but with your hope. You had hope for this life, and you put it in letters to a man you had never met, and when you were gone the hope was still in the letters, and it made him into someone who could recognize me when I arrived, and I have been grateful for that every single day. I have been grateful for you every single day." She wore the silver brooch on the day they marked 8 years in Harlow Creek, a quiet anniversary dinner at Mrs. Garfield's hotel, just the two of them, and then Clara and Thomas afterward for pie and coffee. William was 8 years old and at home with Esteban's daughter, who was 15 and entirely capable, and Ceci was 6 and had been asleep before they left and would, they knew, be awake and opinionated by the time they returned. They sat in the lamplit hotel dining room and James looked at her across the table with the look she had come to know better than any other face in the world, the look that was steady and warm and completely present, and he said, with the directness he had never lost in 8 years of marriage, "I am very glad you were on that stage." Florence laughed, the same way she had laughed on their first evening in this same room, a little undignified and entirely genuine. "You are very glad the stage arrived at all," she said. "You were so careful not to hope for too much." "I was hoping for exactly as much as I was given," James said. "I simply did not know what form it would take." Florence reached across the table and touched his hand, the way she had touched it on their first evening, palm against the back of his hand, the turquoise ring catching the candlelight. "I came west wearing my sister's name," she said, "and you knew before I stepped off that stage and you said come down anyway." "I would say it again," James said, "every time." She looked at him, and the candle between them was the same kind of low, warm candle it had been that first evening 8 years ago, and the mountains were still outside in the dark doing their enormous permanent work, and the creek was still running cold and clear through the canyon, and somewhere 3 miles out on the land they had built together their children were sleeping in the house James had made with his own hands, and Florence Ralston Atkins felt the full, deep, quiet weight of a life that had been made rather than simply happened, made out of courage and honesty and work, and the willingness to say the true thing even when it was frightening, and she thought that it was more than. She had dared to want in a boarding house in Cincinnati 8 years ago with $2 and a carpetbag and a letter addressed to a dead woman. It was so much more, and it was hers. The third child came in the summer of 1887, another boy, smaller than William had been and quieter, with his mother's brown eyes and his father's jaw, and a disposition from the very first week that was so serene it made Clara Webb say, She suspected a mistake had been made somewhere in the delivery, and he would turn out to be someone else entirely. They named him Thomas Esteban Atkins, Thomas for Clara's husband, who was a quiet and decent man who had been a good friend to both of them, and Esteban for the man who had been there from the first and who had made more of the ranch possible than he ever claimed credit for. Esteban, upon hearing the news of the name, was so moved that he had to go outside for a few minutes, and when he came back his eyes were noticeably clear, and he said nothing about why he had needed the air. Rosa made a cake. It was the best cake Florence had ever eaten. She said so, and Rosa shrugged with the elegance of a woman who knows her own gifts and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. William, at 8, received the news of a second younger sibling with the philosophical adaptability of a child who has been through this before. He came to look at the baby with a serious expression, and then announced that this one looked less angry than Cecy had looked, which Florence thought was fair, and then he went back outside to see about the horses. Because at 8 years old the horses were the most important thing in his world, and had been for some time and would be, Florence knew, for a long time to come. Cecy, at 5, had opinions about the baby that were numerous and detailed, and expressed without self-consciousness. She wanted to hold him immediately, and did so with the careful, fierce attention she brought to everything, her small face utterly concentrated, and the baby looked up at her with his serene dark eyes and did not cry, which Cecy took as an endorsement, and which Florence thought was probably accurate. The autumn of 1887 was when Clara told Florence, over the Wednesday sewing circle, that she was also expecting, her first after 4 years of marriage. Florence was so pleased she stood up and embraced Clara right in the middle of the circle, which surprised Clara and delighted her, and the other women made congratulatory sounds, and Mrs. Garfield, who had been attending the circle since before Florence arrived, said that Harlow Creek was growing up, and she sounded pleased about it in the way that a woman is pleased who has watched a community become more than the sum of its parts. Florence and Clara's children grew up alongside each other the way the children of close friends do, in the easy, intimate way that is its own education in how to be with other people. Clara's daughter, born in March of 1888 and named Ada, was from the beginning Cecy's most devoted companion and most effective opponent, and the two of them together were, as Thomas Webb put it one Sunday afternoon watching them organize a full-scale imaginary territory from the bank of the creek, either the future of civilization or the end of it, and probably both. The land around Harlow Creek changed during these years, changed with the territory and the times. The railroad came through the county in 1885, 30 miles north of town, and while it did not come through Harlow Creek itself, it changed what was possible for everyone within reach of it, making the freighting of goods faster and cheaper, and the movement of cattle to market less dependent on the long drives south. James made use of it with his characteristic pragmatic efficiency, and without the nostalgia that some of the older ranchers expressed for a way of doing things that the railroad was rendering obsolete. Things change, he said, and the question is always whether you change with them or stand in the road. Florence thought of this often in the years that followed, watching the territory change and the town change and the people in it change, and watching herself change too, filling out into the person she had been moving toward, she thought, for a long time before she arrived here. She was not the woman she had been in Cincinnati, the careful, frightened woman with $2 and a borrowed name. She was not even entirely the woman she had been in that first summer at the ranch, still new to the land and the work and the particular quality of the life here. She was herself, fully and finally, in the way that you become yourself when enough of the right things happen to you and you are willing to let them. She was the woman who had come west on a stage and stepped down into the dust of Harlow Creek and told the truth about who she was to the first person who asked. She was the woman who had found the water rights document and ridden 3 miles alone in the night to save a child from fever, and planted a garden in the style that the people who knew this land best had developed over generations, and learned Spanish at 40 years of age because she wanted to. She was the woman who delivered babies and set broken bones and rode out in weather that most people would not, because someone needed help and she knew how to give it. She was James Atkins's wife, which was not the smallest of the things she was, but was not the whole of it either, and James had understood this from the beginning, in the way that he understood things about her that she had not yet articulated, the way that he had read her from a stage window before she stepped off and said, "Come down anyway." In the spring of 1890, on an evening in May when the air smelled of sage and the mountains were going gold in the last light, Florence sat on the west porch of the house that James had built, and her children had grown in, and her garden surrounded, and she looked at the land that stretched away from her in every direction, the red and gold and green of it, the enormous living country that she had once been frightened by and had come to love as deeply as she loved anything. And she heard the door behind her and felt James sit down beside her, and she leaned against him without turning, the way you lean against something that has been solid so long you no longer have to think about whether it will hold. He put his arm around her. The evening went on doing what evenings do. The mountains watched from their ancient distance. The creek talked somewhere in the canyon. "What are you thinking?" James said. Florence thought about how to answer. She thought about Cincinnati and the boarding house and the letter addressed to a dead woman. She thought about the stage rolling into Harlow Creek and the man standing at the edge of the street with his hat in his hand. She thought about the turquoise ring and the silver brooch and the journal full of letters to Cecilia and the 3 children inside the house and the years between then and now, the hard ones and the good ones and the ones that were both at once, which were the truest ones. "I am thinking that it all made sense," she said. "Even the parts that did not seem to at the time, even the lie I told to get here, even the fear, all of it made sense in the end." James was quiet for a moment. She could feel him breathing, slow and steady, the way he breathed when he was content. "It made you," he said. Florence looked at the mountains. They were turning purple now, the last of the gold fading from their peaks, and the first stars were appearing in the deep blue east. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage 12 years ago with a borrowed name and a desperate hope and had been seen and welcomed and loved anyway. "Yes," she said, "it made me." The stars came out one by one over the New Mexico territory, the same stars that had been there before any of them, before the ranch and the town and the creek, before all the human stories told beneath them. Florence watched them appear and felt James's arm steady around her, and heard her children's voices from inside the house, William calling something to Ceci in the tone of an older brother who is being patient with great effort, Thomas's small, serene voice adding something that made both the older ones laugh, and she thought that this was what it meant to have arrived somewhere. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of change. Just this. The certainty that wherever you were going from here, you were going from solid ground, with someone beside you who had chosen you completely, and a life that was genuinely, irrevocably yours. William would grow tall like his father and take over the Eastern Range management by the time he was 16, with a head for the land that delighted James and a stubbornness about his methods that delighted Florence. Ceci would grow up to be a teacher, the best the Harlow Creek school had seen, and would eventually marry the son of a ranching family to the north, a young man who looked at her with the same quality of attention that James had always brought to Florence, which was how Florence knew he was right for her. Thomas would be the quiet, constant one, the one who kept the center of the family steady when the others moved and changed and grew, and he would stay on the ranch and run it with William when the time came, and together the 2 brothers would make it something that lasted. Dr. Pryor would say, on his last visit before he retired, that Florence Ralston Atkins had done more practical good for more people in the outlying communities of that county than any trained physician he had worked with, and he said it in the manner of someone stating a plain fact rather than paying a compliment, which made it mean more. Dolly's grandson, Kai's son, would come to help Esteban on the ranch the summer William turned 16, and the arrangement would prove so productive and so respectful of what everyone brought to it that it would continue for 20 years. A small example of the kind of relationship that was possible in a world that more often chose otherwise. Mrs. Garfield would keep the hotel until she was 74 years old, and then turn it over to her niece with the specific instructions that the dining room was to be kept exactly as it was, because some things did not need improving. Clara would remain Florence's closest friend for the rest of their lives, visiting every Wednesday for 40 years, and the Wednesday sewing circle would continue, and the ratio of actual sewing to the exchange of information and opinion would remain roughly the same, which was entirely appropriate. And Florence herself would sit on that west porch for decades more, in the changing seasons of the New Mexico territory, watching the light move over the mountains that had become as familiar to her as breathing. And she would keep the silver brooch in her jewelry box and wear it on important days. And she would keep the turquoise ring on her finger. And she would keep writing to Cecilia in the journal, which by 1890 was the third volume, and showed no signs of reaching its conclusion. She wrote on the last page of the first volume, which she had kept and which sat on the shelf alongside James's books, the worn and well-used ones. You wanted to come west and start again. You did come west, Cease. You came in me. You came in the letters that made James into someone who could see me. You came in the hope you put in an envelope and mailed to a stranger who turned out not to be strange at all. I have lived the life you reached for, and I have tried to live it well, and I believe with my whole heart that wherever you are, you can see that I have. James read that page once, years later, when Florence was outside with the children and he was alone in the house. He read it standing by the kitchen table where they had had their first supper, and then he set the journal down carefully, and he stood in the kitchen of the house he had built with his own hands in a country he had chosen with his whole heart, and he thought about what it was to have someone in your life who made every part of it mean more than it had before, and he thought that he did not have adequate language for that, only the feeling itself, which was large and quiet and permanent, like the mountains. He went outside to find Florence, and she was in the garden in the afternoon light, her hair loose from its pins as it always was by afternoon, her hands in the earth, entirely at home in the world. He stood at the garden gate and watched her, and she looked up and saw him and smiled, and it was the smile he had first seen in the hotel dining room on the night she had told him the truth and been welcomed anyway, natural and warm and completely without guile. He opened the gate and walked to where she was, and she stood up and brushed the earth from her hands, and he put his arms around her right there in the garden, in the full afternoon, and she put her arms around him. And the garden smelled of growing things, and the mountains watched from their distance, and the creek ran clear and cold through the canyon. And Florence Ralston Atkins, who had come west wearing her sister's name and been found and loved and made whole, held her husband and felt the whole of her life around her, and knew it was good, and knew it was hers and was glad.